And you say we're headed for a tsunami of inflation. When? I mean, that is the big question, Peter. When?
Yeah, well, in my mind, I think it's already started. I mean, you could look at some of these price increases, and they're very spectacular. And, they're just starting to work their way through the system. And again, I don't think we're transitioning, or it's transitory, unless you're saying we're transitioning from low inflation to high inflation, which is really what's happening. But what you want to look at to understand inflation is you look at the money supply, because it's the money supply that was being inflated. I mean, literally, that's where the word comes from. Inflation is to expand. You inflate, right? When something is inflated, it expands. Prices don't expand. They go up, they go down, but they don't expand. It's money supply that expands. And we have the most expansionary monetary policy in U.S. history. And no other era is even close to what we're doing right now. So this is massive inflation. And so to expect that prices are not going to respond by rising is ridiculous. But then you also have to look at the supply side of the equation, because as the Federal Reserve is dumping all this newly printed money onto the economy, there's actually less stuff for people to buy, because more and more people who used to be engaged in productive activities, whether they were producing goods or providing services, a lot of these people are now sitting at home collecting these government checks. So we're creating more money to buy goods, but we're producing fewer goods to buy. And so how can prices not go way up? I mean, anybody who doesn't think that prices are going to go way up, I mean, just not only don't they understand basic economics, they just don't even have any common sense.
Well, Peter, to your point, a lot of people sitting at home collecting unemployment benefits that pay them a lot better than their actual jobs. And of course, we've also got the highest excess savings in U.S. households that we've ever had. There's about $1.6 trillion in excess savings, U.S. savings at multi-year highs. So what happens when the economy is fully opened and all of that pent-up demand is released? I mean, to your point, more money chasing fewer goods. So is that when you expect the surge, when we have full economic opening?
Yeah, you remember, a lot of this money that people have saved was sent to them by the government. It's not like they earned more money and just didn't spend some of their increased earnings. The government just handed out this money. And yes, a lot of people haven't been able to spend it yet because they haven't got out of the house. And so they have bought a lot of goods. That's why our trade deficits in merchandise are at all-time record highs. So unemployed Americans have been able to shop on Amazon and buy, products made in China. But there's still a lot of other money that they haven't spent yet that was provided to them by the government. And also, we don't know to what extent are Americans not paying their rent, not paying their mortgages because of these moratoriums, and instead they're just holding on to the cash. So who knows, right? Because if you're told by your landlord, we can't evict you if you don't pay your rent, well, why pay it? I mean, I can live here for free. And so people could be accumulating this cash because they're not paying some of their bills. But yes, eventually, all of this hoarded cash is going to be spent. And if we're not producing more goods and services for the money to be spent on, then all it could do is bid up the prices on the goods and services that already exist.
So in this scenario, which you've described before, I mean, you're calling for an unprecedented economic disaster following this unprecedented stimulus, both in the US and globally. But what does that look like, Peter? Describe that in all the vivid, ugly details.
I don't know if I could describe it if it hasn't happened yet. I mean, we can look at other countries and how, they've dealt with these problems. But we're in a situation where we have so much debt. And in fact, Janet Yellen was asked a question today. I was watching her in a Q&A.
Right.
And the person questioning her said, hey, when you were Fed chair, you did warn that we had too much debt. And here you are now as Secretary of the Treasury, we have a lot more debt. I think it was 70% of GDP when she said it was a problem, and now it's over 100%. And that's just debt held by the public, not total debt.
Right.
The question was, why aren't you worried anymore about the debt? And, her answer to that question was that, well, interest rates are really low. And the reason it's not a problem is because the rates are so low. And so servicing the debt is not that big a burden given how low rates are. But it's unfortunate that the senator who asked her that question didn't follow up with a better question. What happens when interest rates go up? I mean, isn't it reckless and irresponsible to say we can afford all this debt because temporarily we have these low rates of interest, knowing that the national debt is financed mostly with short-term paper and the government has to constantly roll over these T-bills and, they're going to get the prevailing rate. Well, if you have this huge amount of debt and the only reason there's not a crisis is because interest rates are low, what happens if they're not low? What happens if interest rates are high? And I think that's the box the Federal Reserve is in, because the Federal Reserve knows the only thing between the US government and default or insolvency is artificially low interest rates. So if the Federal Reserve knows if it raises interest rates, it bankrupts the government, how is the Federal Reserve going to fight inflation? Because if this pickup in inflation is not transitory, and obviously the longer the Fed waits to acknowledge it's not transitory, the bigger the inflation problem becomes. And so if inflation is at 5 or 6 or 7% officially by the time the Fed realizes that it wasn't transitory, how does it fight that inflation without bankrupting the US government? The answer is it can't. So my thinking is if it can't fight inflation without bankrupting the US government, it won't fight the inflation, which means it bankrupts the US public because it destroys the value of the dollar.
So, Peter, what does all of this inflation, which, as you say, at some point or another has to kick in, mean for the dollar, and particularly for the dollar's status as the global reserve currency?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's going to mean the end of the dollar. I think it may mean the end of the dollar as we know it, as the world's reserve currency. And so a world in which the dollar is no longer the reserve currency is going to be a world in which the dollar buys a lot less. The purchasing power of the dollar, the exchange rate of the dollar relative to other currencies is going to depreciate substantially, especially when you consider how many dollars the Federal Reserve is going to be printing in order to enable all of this government spending. And remember, the only way the US government can service the debt that it has is if the Federal Reserve provides the money, because they're never going to get it from the taxpayers directly through taxes. They're going to get it indirectly through inflation. So this is massive money printing and monetary debasement. And as the dollar collapses, so too will the American standard of living, because Americans have been living for generations now off of the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar being that world's reserve currency. And that is the reason that we can get away with running these massive trade deficits. We can still consume a lot, but not produce a lot, because the rest of the world is willing to produce for us because they're willing to take the dollars that we print. But of course, it doesn't cost us anything to create dollars out of thin air, nor does it really transfer any real value to our trading partners. Now, right now it does if the dollar is the reserve currency, but if it's not the reserve currency, it's just a piece of paper. And if we don't produce products for them to buy, then there's no reason to hold that paper, and they won't. And so the prices are going to collapse of the dollar. But what that means is that all of the goods that we've been importing are going to be so expensive that very few Americans will be able to afford to buy them. And it also means that a lot of the stuff that we're now producing for domestic consumption, a lot of those products will start being exported to people in other countries who now can outbid Americans for those goods because their currencies are much more valuable. So the whole American standard of living collapses.